Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum.
Good morning, everyone, and good evening, Prof, from your hand. My name is Bello Ridwan Laba. I'm a Nigerian and also a master's student at the Faculty of Education, IIU. So it's my honor to be the moderator for today's program, which I believe will be a very interesting discourse to learning from the expertise in the field. Let me open the session by urging us to recite Bismillah together. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. After that, I want to urge all our participants to please put on their camera so that everybody will be shown. So that's the first thing. Then secondly, this particular public lecture is a collaboration between the Faculty of Education, IIU, and AIFIS. So, and it is a lecture under a compulsory course offered to master's students of Faculty of Education, so which is Education and Society. So we urge all participants to, of course, take notes because we believe this will be an interesting discourse. In our midst, we have our lecturers, we have our dean, and also our lecturers from the IIIU Faculty of Education. Without wasting much of our time, I will give the space to our dean, who is also a lecturer teaching this particular course in IIIU. So Prof. Dina Numela, our dean, will introduce our lecturer for today. Prof, the space is yours.
Thank you very much, Bello Ridwan, for being our moderator this morning. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening, Professor Bob Hefner. Good morning, my students and participants of this public lecture. I would like to thank you very much to Professor Bob Hefner for accepting our invitation to give a public lecture today. This is the third time for the Faculty of Education to invite Professor Hefner to be the speaker in our faculty events. Well, in fact, this is the fourth time because previously in October 2021, IIIU has also invited Professor Hefner to be the speaker in the IIIU webinar. Yeah, at that time it was during the COVID and we did a webinar series online. And the event in which Faculty of Education invited Professor Hefner was after the IIIU webinar series. And the first one was in the first annual conference in 2022 as the keynote speaker. And the second was in 2023 as the guest lecturer in the same course, Education and Society, which Dr. Ami Al-Humami and I, the lecturers of this course. And last year topic was the same with the topic today, the politics of Islamic education in Asian countries and the best model of Islamic education. The difference is that this year we collaborate with AIFIS, American Institute for Indonesian Studies, in which Professor Hefner is the president of AIFIS. Here, I would like to acknowledge also the presence of Pak Anas Bentari from AIFIS. Good morning, Pak Anas. Thank you for your presence and for this event. It was his suggestion that we made this lecture public in order to be more accessible to larger audience and many more people can learn from the expertise of Professor Hefner. Pak Bob, that's the nickname of Professor Robert Hefner. And as American scholar who is expert on Indonesia, Pak Bob, also his family, Professor Nancy J. Smith, and then his daughter, I know, often visit Indonesia. And Professor Hefner's next visit comes very soon, actually in July 2024 to Yogyakarta for Association for Asian Studies in Asia Conference, in which many American scholars will join this conference. And he will not be able to come in person to IIIU in July, but he will be back in November, in which he will come in person to Triple IU. Thank you for this. And I know that Professor Hefner is a very well-known scholar through his books, many books. But those of you who are new to him or not yet familiar with Pak Bob, let me introduce him. Professor Robert Hefner is a professor of anthropology and global affairs at the Pardee School of Global Affairs at Boston University. During 2009 until 2010, he served as the president of the American Association for Asian Studies. So that's the conference that's we will be held in Yogyakarta next month. And he currently, from 2021 until 2024, is the president of AIFIS and the director of the Center for the Study of Asia at Boston University. Yeah. So the CV is very long, but I would to cut it short, in which I would like to announce about intellectual endeavor that Professor Hefner has directed 21 research projects and organized 16 international conferences. So there might be many more today. Drawing on specialists from political science, sociology, religious studies, anthropology, and law. Professor Hefner has authored or edited 21 books. Yeah, please correct me if you have more than 21 books. And his most recent book, which was published in January 2024, is Islam and Citizenship, Democratic Indonesia and the Quest for the Inclusive Public Ethics. I think that's all my introduction. I hope all of you can enjoy the lecture from Pak Bob, and I will let Ridwan to lead this morning. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Walaikum assalam wa barakatuh. Thank you for the wonderful introduction of Professor Robert. Waste much of our time. Also, I would like to urge again to remind our audience that this is a public lecture, and it is advised that we take notes because we are learning from the experts in the field. Also, please let us put on our camera so that we'll be able to see our faces. Before I give the space to Professor Robert, we have like 40 to 45 minutes for him to deliver his lecture, and after which, by God's grace, we're going to have a Q&A session. The session we hold either by typing the question on the chat or by raising our virtual hand. So without wasting much of our time, without much delay, I'm going to give the space to Professor Robert to please give us the insightful, wonderful presentation. Professor, the space is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Again, as Bu Nina Norela explained, I have had extensive and consistently enjoyable interactions with the IIIU. Indeed, I believe some years ago, before the IIIU existed, I was approached by some Islamic Muslim educators, and we had discussions about what such a university should be. And I'm pleased to see today that the IIIU has become such a remarkable institution, a really exceptional example of Islamic higher education, but also an exceptional example of what will be a central theme of my talk today, which is how Indonesia, and I mean Muslim Indonesia, has become a leader in Islamic education. And I mean that I'm going to focus in particular on Islamic higher education, but I do so against the backdrop that, keep in mind, in the 1950s, 1960s, and indeed as late as the 1980s, very few people would have thought that Indonesia would transform itself into one of the major centers of Islamic higher education in the world. And that is my thesis today. I've traveled to many Muslim majority countries. I worked longest, of course, in Indonesia, but I've traveled specifically to Islamic universities in Egypt, in Morocco, in Turkey, and in Jordan, as well as India and Pakistan. And while all have their unique specificity and all have a certain exceptional quality, I think from a historical and comparative perspective, we need to recognize that Indonesia has undergone one of the greatest transformations of Islamic higher education seen in in modern times. So that's what I want to talk about today. Before I begin, one final comment. As you can see, I was in a little accident today, or yesterday actually, and I had to go to the hospital and have some stitches. I apologize for a wajah yang sedikit kurang kurang adab, kurang rapi, yes. So Bu Nina, maafkan saja, yeah. So I know I'm supposed to speak in English, and I will speak in Indonesian, but in English, but I had to give my apologies for my presentation. It's just one of those events in life that we all experience. So again, my topic today is how Indonesia became a world leader in Islamic education. I want to talk about this issue from a comparative perspective. I begin here. Over the past generation, really over the past 30 years, the challenge of living together harmoniously in societies characterized by great ethnic and religious diversity has become more pressing and more challenging in many countries of the world. In Western liberal democracies in the 2000s, liberal democracies that used to rather arrogantly think of themselves as having resolved the question of how to live together in difference. In the 2000s, the confluence of mass immigration, the rise of alt-right populisms, if you know that phrase, and the growing Islamophobia, shocking, growing Islamophobia across much of the Western world, challenged and made people doubt about the assumptions as to democracy, diversity, and inclusive citizen belonging that had once been assumed operative in Western societies. Western Democrats began to think maybe they didn't, maybe they weren't as successful as they had once thought. Now, this loss of confidence in received formula for inclusive citizenship and civic education that we saw in the West was paralleled in the same period from the 2010s to today by an equally alarming sense of concern and indeed anxiety in much of the Muslim majority world, especially in the Arab majority world, where after 2011, we saw the great hope of the Arab Spring give way to, at least in the political sphere, a kind of dark Arab winter. Now, against this backdrop of a kind of anxiety as to how to live together in difference and to create educational programs for doing so, and now against this background, I wanted my remarks today to talk about Muslim educational and ethical traditions for living together in the country where you are all situated today, that is Indonesia. Now, as is well known, Indonesia has had its share of ethno-religious conflicts over the course of its history. Indeed, in the late 1950s, many people thought that this deeply plural society was not likely to survive. But Indonesia proved its skeptics wrong. And indeed, today, of all of the world's Muslim majority countries, and I would say among all of the world's democratic countries, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, Indonesia has today developed by far the most successful program for upholding both democracy and a multicultural citizenship, a multi-religious and multi-ethnic citizenship anywhere in the world. It is really a remarkable achievement, particularly if we think back to the 50s, 60s, where no one thought Indonesia was likely to survive let alone flourish as it is and as Islamic education is today. Now, let me transition. The fact that Indonesia has achieved democracy and a significant measure of citizenship inclusivity is not, I would suggest, a sociological accident. It is instead the result of its distinctive synergies and collaborations. Here's my thesis, the core focus of my remarks today. It's the product of distinctive synergies and collaborations, especially in Muslim education and society. In particular, Muslim educators have grappled with the question in Indonesia, have grappled with the questions of related to civic education and what I would call civic pluralist coexistence, how to coexist in a plural society. They've done so with remarkable insight since the dawn of the Republic in the 1940s, but they have done so with particular impressive effect, especially since the 1980s and the 1990s. The large number of Islamic educators dedicating themselves today to civic education, democracy, and Pancasila pluralism is one of the most remarkable achievements of Islamic education anywhere in the world. And I'll have to explain what I mean by that. If you're not an Indonesian, my reference to Pancasila pluralism may seem obscure, but I'll get into that in a moment. Muslim educators in Indonesia's state Islamic university system, in particular, have played the leading role in bringing about this achievement, the achievement of a Muslim commitment to democracy and inclusive citizenship. They have done so, and here's the very important point, not through thinking that they have to follow a European or Western model of quarantining or privatizing religion, taking it out of the public sphere. On the contrary, Muslim educators have achieved this remarkable fact by encouraging Muslim scholars and the general public to develop specifically Islamic resources and rationales for citizen inclusivity, democracy, and a broader maslahah, public good. More on that. Elsewhere, okay, this is all by way of introduction again. Elsewhere, I've referred to Muslim Indonesian educational achievements like these as examples of, I choose these phrases quite deliberately. They're examples of an intellectualization and maslahatization of Islamic learning and ethics. Intellectualization and maslahatization. By intellectualization and maslahatization, I mean the deployment of Islamic ideals, education, and usuli methodology so as to serve the public good, maslahah, with regards to matters of democracy, inclusive citizenship, and of Muslim public ethics. It is one of the great achievements of Indonesia that in its Islamic educational sector has succeeded in creating institutions dedicated not just to these tasks, but to these tasks by way of integrating the sciences of the world with the sciences of God, the sciences of revelation. This, in any case, now it's a grand scheme, grand claim I'm making. This is, in any case, my claim today. And now I want to proceed a little bit more methodically and explain just how it was that Indonesia achieved this remarkable progress and remarkable distinction in Islamic education and a public maslahah good. I want to cite three keys as to how Indonesia and Indonesian Muslim educators in particular achieve this good. Three features. Now, the first of these features is one that distinguishes the history of Islamic education in Nusantara. I'll use the term Nusantara so as to refer to pre-Republican Indonesia as well. So a first feature that distinguishes the history of Islamic learning and education in Nusantara from that in some core areas of the Muslim Middle East and South Asia has to do with the relatively late arrival in the Indonesian archipelago, that is the 19th and 20th century, of an institutional equivalent of the Middle Eastern madrasa. Madrasas arrived very late in their fully formed educational form arrived very late in the late 18th century, and they became really only common in the 19th and 20th century. Now, for those of you who are Indonesian, you know that when I refer to an Islamic boarding school for the study of the middle and advanced Islamic sciences, I'm referring to what in Indonesia is referred to as a pesantren or pondok pesantren. And these became a prominent feature in the Islamic social landscape in Nusantara only 4 or 5 centuries after the first waves of conversion to Islam. So you had conversion to Islam first in the 13th and 14th century, or a little bit later in Eastern Indonesia. And several centuries later, only several centuries later, unlike the pattern in the Middle East, did madrasas arrive. Now, as a result of this historical sequencing, Islamic conversion occurred first, and Islamic higher education, madrasa education, arrived later. Islamic culture in the Indonesian archipelago for most of its first centuries was certainly genuinely Islamic, but not in a fiqh focus or madrasa grounded way. Shahab Ahmad has made a similar observation, I would say, about Islam in Central and South Asia, but I won't make that comparison much today, but we can talk about it in succession. But my point is that the first centuries of Islamization in Nusantara saw the dissemination of what were genuinely Islamic traditions of knowledge and practice, but most were not. Most were more dedicated to Muslim morality and tasawwuf spirituality, kind of Allah-mindedness, than they were the development or inculcation of a sophisticated fiqh or jurisprudential register. As the historian of Islam in Indonesia, M.B. Hooker, has observed, most institutions, quote, most Muslims and most centers of learning in Indonesia, I quote him here, push the rationalization of the mystic mode, tasawwuf, to its furthest conclusions, and its effect was non or indeed anti-legalistic. So Islam, for its first centuries in Indonesia, was an Islam that, of course, recognized ethics and God's law, but did not systematically concentrate on the development or inculcation of fiqh, because the madrasas were not yet widespread. Now, much that is unique about the history of Islam in the Indonesian archipelago can be traced back to this distinctive sequencing of Islamization first and Islamic higher education, madrasa education, arriving later. To appreciate the importance of this sequencing, let's pause for a moment and examine Islamic education in Indonesia in comparative Muslim perspective. Let's compare Indonesia and Islamic higher education in Indonesia with what was the pattern in the Middle East and South Asia, particularly from the 10th century on. Now, in these latter regions, South Asia and Middle East, Central Asia, the madrasa, as I think everybody knows here, was the key educational institution across vast portions of the Muslim majority world. As we all know, just to characterize it, the classical madrasa in these lands was a residential school or boarding school or college, as Makhdisi has described it, for intermediate and advanced instruction in the Islamic sciences in general, and the madhab-based fields of Islamic jurisprudence in particular. Madrasas provided learning in the Islamic sciences in general, but particularly they provided expertise in fiqh, the queen of the Islamic sciences. Now, briefly again, back to the Middle East. In the Middle East, the first madrasa, they didn't appear in the 7th or 8th century. They actually appeared only in the late 9th and early 10th century, 3 centuries after the age of the Prophet Muhammad, but still early on in the Middle East's Islamization. So they would go on to play a central role in the shaping of Middle Eastern and South Asian Islamic civilization. Indeed, if I may quote the historian of Islamic education, Jonathan Berkey, he points out that by the 12th century Common Era, and I will use the Common Era, maafkan saja, yeah, by the 12th century Common Era, the madrasa had become, and I quote him, perhaps the most characteristic religious institution of the medieval Near Eastern landscape. It was critical to the Islamic learning and Islamic civilization. From the perspective of Islamic law and ethics, the rise of the madrasa from the 10th century on in this Near Eastern landscape facilitated, and I quote Berkey again, a great recentering and homogenization of Islamic knowledge and authority, relatively speaking, that is. In particular, madrasas with their fiqh-focused, jurisprudentially focused curriculum came to occupy a privileged space in Islamic higher education. And as a result, Muslim public ethics itself showed a strongly legalistic fiqh-mindedness, as one would expect in societies with an abundance of madrasas. Now, but here's where the contrast with Southeast Asia, Nusantara, becomes interesting. As Jajat Burhanuddin, the late Ajumardi Azra, may he rest in peace at the side of Allah, my dear friend Azumardi Azra, and as M.B. Hooker have also said, during its first centuries, Islamic education in Southeast Asia in general, and Nusantara in particular, had few institutional equivalents of the Middle Eastern madrasa. Islamic learning existed, and it was in its own way sophisticated and deep, but it was organized around small halaqah circles of murshid sheikhs and their murid disciples, focused in particular on tasawwuf and issues of general ethical learning rather than systematic study of fiqh. It is important, let me emphasize, it's important not to see this peculiar educational legacy at this point as an example of some sort of Indonesian exceptionalism, or as some Western scholars used to much too simplistically say, as an example of the fact that Islam in Indonesia was very tipis, very thin, or somehow superficial or syncretic. I think that's a much too simplistic characterization. Islam in Indonesia, Islam in Nusantara was genuinely Islamic, but it did not yet have the madrasa-grounded emphasis on fiqh and jurisprudence that the late arrival of madrasas would eventually facilitate. Inevitably, however, things would change. As the modern era advanced, Indonesia's Islamic educational infrastructure changed, and indeed it changed rather dramatically. From the mid-19th century onward, the first madrasa or pondok pesantren arrived actually in the late 18th century, but they really became pervasive only in the mid-19th century onward, as the flow of Muslim pilgrims and students from the archipelago to Arabia and Egypt brought about a heightened Nusantara engagement with Middle Eastern madrasas and the fiqh-based curriculum that they emphasized. Now, Muslim Indonesians returning at this period from centers of learning in the Middle East quickly went on to establish the Indonesian equivalent of the Middle Eastern madrasa, which again, as I mentioned before, and as all of you know, is in Indonesia known as the pondok or pondok pesantren. It is, in its curriculum and all other regards, its social organization, really a classical madrasa. Now, just as had earlier occurred from the 10th century on with classical madrasas in the Middle East, the study of the Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet, and Islamic law and jurisprudence, or fiqh, lay at the heart of this new pesantren curriculum in a much more systematic way than had been the case during the first century of Islamic learning and education in Indonesia from the 12th to the 17th, 18th century. However, by the end of the 19th century, it looked as if Indonesian education, Islamic education in Indonesia was going in much the same direction that madrasa-grounded education in the Middle East had gone. That is, with the rise of the madrasa, relatively late, we were beginning to see a heightened appreciation and awareness of fiqh's nuances and complexity. But it's important to emphasize that the story in Indonesia this late arrival of the madrasa actually coincided with nationalism, the rise of nationalism, in some very interesting and important ways. So the educational story in Indonesia, the Islamic educational story in Indonesia requires a remarkable specificity and, I would say, dynamism, one that by the beginning of the 20th century adapts it well for to respond to Dutch colonialism and to respond to the challenge of modern other varieties of Islamic learning. So what do I mean? Let me talk in particular about two changes that took place. So you have the Pondok Pesantren, the Indonesian madrasa, arrives relatively late, but it very quickly undergoes some very interesting evolutions. The first of these evolutions had to do with what scholarly commentaries on Islamic Pesantren in Nusantara have long referred to as the Kitab Kuning, or yellow books, which they're called yellow because of the color of the paper that they were printed on. But most kitab kunings, are actually not just simple books, but they're commentaries, known in Indonesian as syarah, in Arabic as syarah. They're commentaries in local dialect and sometimes also in Arabic, which discuss some older text or older kitab, which itself is typically a commentary gloss on some earlier Arabic text. See, the madrasa, the Pondok Pesantren, is beginning to engage in a much deeper way with transnational varieties of Islamic learning. But very quickly, a very interesting set of changes take place from, again, the late 19th, early 20th century to today's. One study by a Dutch scholar named L.W.C. Vandenberg, and the second set of studies, if we compare the Vandenberg study, which is from 1886, with more recent studies by Azumar the late, Azumardi Asma, my dear friend, and Martin van Brausen, allow us to appreciate how rapidly this curriculum changed in the Pondok Pesantren. Vandenberg and Azumardi's research revealed that although commentaries drawing on the Quran and Hadith were widely used in boarding schools in the late 19th century, full Hadith collections were not yet widely studied. Very interesting. Full Hadith collections were not yet highly studied. The absence is surprising because if one knows a little bit about Islamic education in the 10th and 11th century Common Era in the Middle East and South Asia, we know that those full Hadith collections, which were created in the 10th and 11th centuries, are very, very important for the development of fiqh jurisprudence. You have to know Hadith, Quran and Hadith in a systematic way if you're going to engage fiqh in a comparably systematic way. And Vandenberg's study, which again dates from 1886, makes it clear that actually the first Pondok Pesantren here in Indonesia, or at least the first family of, had a relatively limited number of commentaries. They had really only one systematic tafsir Quran, and the systematic study of Hadith was just beginning. So it wasn't yet up to what was a South Asian and Middle Eastern standards. But this is what makes the studies by Azumardi Azra and Martin van Branissen almost a century later, in the 1970s and the 1980s, they come and they look again at the Pondok Pesantren curriculum and they compare it with what Vandenberg had emphasized, where he said, well, they don't really have most of the textbooks that were there in use in the Muslim Middle East and South Asia, so that these were not yet kind of world quality, you would say, world quality madrasas. But that changed. That changed, so that by the time we get to Azumardi and Mazra's, or Azumardi, Azra, and Branissen's change, listen to how Martin van Branissen describes the change. Here's what he says, based again on a systematic study carried out in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I quote him: a significant change in the Pondok Pesantren has taken place over the past century. There are now no less than 10 different Quranic commentaries in Arabic, Malay, Javanese, and Indonesian in the collections, in addition to straightforward translations or tafsir into Javanese and Sundanese. In other words, madrasas, the Pondok Pesantren had developed a much more systematic, much more sophisticated curriculum. I continue with Martin van Brana's statement. He also notes, quote, I quote him, the number of hadith collections is even more striking. There are almost no pesantren today where the hadith is not studied in a systematic way as a separate subject. The main emphasis instruction remains, of course, fiqh, the Islamic science par excellence. There have been no remarkable changes in the fiqh text studies, but the discipline usul al-fiqh, the foundations or bases of fiqh, have been added to the curriculum of many pesantrens, thereby allowing a more flexible, sophisticated, and dynamic understanding of fiqh. I apologize for all that detail, but the basic point is that madrasas arrive in their Pondok Pesantren variety, arrive late, but over the course of the century, and their curriculum at first is relatively simple, but over the course of the century, by the time you get to the 1970s and 1980s, they are of world caliber quality. So, and all of this is, of course, contrary to what many critics, if you go back to the 1950s or the period when I first came to Indonesia, the late 70s and 1980s, many people used to dismiss pesantren. Muslims and Western observers would dismiss Pondok Pesantren and say, oh, well, these are very backward places. They're unchanging. That is not true. In the course of a century and a half, the Pondok Pesantren curriculum had brought itself up to a remarkable global Islamic standard. Now, these impressive innovations in Pesantren education were additionally important because they soon interacted with a second development. I said there were two that I would highlight. A second development in Indonesia's Islamic educational sphere. And this, here I'm referring not to Pondok Pesantren or the Indonesian equivalent of the madrasa, but the rise of the modern Islamic school, Sekolah Islam, sometimes rather confusedly from a comparative perspective called a madrasa, but a Sekolah Islam is a modern school that combines Islamic sciences with general education. Contrary to what is sometimes said about traditionalists and modern Islam in Indonesia, the interaction of educators in the modern Sekolah Islam sector and the traditionalist community was not a negative or zero-sum process. In fact, the innovations introduced by modernist educators in groups like the Muhammadiyah very, very quickly were taken note of by Islamic educators in the much larger network of Islamic Pondok Pesantren, Islamic madrasas associated with groups like the Nahdlatul Ulama. So once again, rather than seeing a kind of negative competition, the dynamism of the modernist Islamic sector served as a model and a kind of spurred further reforms in traditionalist Islamic education, so that by the time we get to the 1950s and 1960s, traditionalist education too is remarkably dynamic. Again, I emphasize, Indonesia is an area of the Muslim world where the dynamism of Islamic education has been nothing less than remarkable. So now, why is all this important? Why was, now let me go back to the modernist example, Muhammadiyah schools and others that called for a mixed curriculum. And now the new modernist promoted, or what today we might say integrated education, was not just a matter of blackboards, having classes, or giving girls education, although modernists introduced all of these reforms into general education, and they did have a hugely important transformative effect. And Indonesia's modernists introduced these reforms, including, I would emphasize, girls' education. in a way, in a fashion, much more rapid and much more forward-looking than their counterparts in some other parts of the Muslim world. And I would say some other parts of the Western Christian world. Indonesia, on matters of women's and girls' education, has always been a remarkable leader. But it wasn't just women's education, blackboards, and the opening of the curriculum. What was really remarkable about a modernist education and a model that then quickly spread to traditionalist sector was the conviction that Islamic education should be a force not just for Islamic piety and knowledge, although of course that's absolutely important, but for good works, mu'amalat, and far-reaching reforms in society. Here's where, again, Indonesia just stands out so remarkably. Islamic education should be a force for change in the whole of society, not a radical force, but a force for ongoing, pervasive, steady, and far-reaching change. Indonesia's modernists insisted that a proper understanding of God's commands, God's Sharia, requires believers to intellectualize and contextualize Islamic education and ethics through a return to the Quran and Sunnah, but also through a commitment to the sciences of the world, which was the modernists knew, and eventually traditionalists knew, sciences of the world that had been the most sophisticated in the entire world in the Middle East and South Asia in the 14th and 15th century, way ahead of their counterparts in Christian Europe. The modernists and soon their NU counterparts also invoked the long recognized legal concept that I referred to earlier of maslahah, or the public interest, the public good, to emphasize that education should facilitate not just, again, individual piety, though that's important, but good works for the well-being of all in society. Here again, Indonesia shines. Over the long run, what was so important about this shift toward a new, what I talked about earlier, as a new intellectualization and maslahatization of Muslim education, is that these reforms opened Islamic education in Indonesia to two things that in some other parts of the Muslim world and some other parts of the Christian world had difficulty being accepted. That is, the idea that religious educators should engage and study the sciences of the world. And secondly, that Islamic knowledge and the sciences of the world should become a force for maslahah, good in society. Here again, Indonesia stands out. Indonesian education, Islamic education, stands out for its remarkable achievement in being ahead of so much of the rest of the world. On this point, the example of Islamic educators in Indonesia speaks to a much discussed challenge in I'm going to jump ahead very quickly because I'm running a little bit behind and I realize I'm running a few minutes late. I'll just emphasize that since the early decades of the 20th century, Muslim educators in both the Muhammadiyah and NU have sought diligently to pursue what scholars of Islamic education like Ibrahim Musa, the South African-based scholar of South Asian, what they have emphasized and what Ibrahim Musa has lamented is all too lacking in much Islamic education around the world. That is a failure, Ibrahim Musa says, to integrate the sciences, the modern sciences of the world with the classical sciences of Islam, the sciences of revelation. Now, I know Ibrahim Musa, he's a friend of mine, but I would simply say that if his generalization about the failure of Islamic educators to integrate the sciences of the world with the sciences of revelation, if it applies perhaps to some parts of the Muslim world, it most certainly does not. It most certainly does not to Islamic education in Indonesia, which has led the world in integrating those two spheres of those two qualities and styles of learning. Now, the impact of Indonesia's broadened educational horizons has never been limited to formal learning or school-based exercises. As I said, another trademark of Islamic education, particularly higher education in Indonesia, has been its conviction that Islamic learning should perform good deeds, mu'amalat, and a kind of welfare activism. And here again, I think Indonesia is remarkable for the way in which it's linked this revised understanding, this expanded understanding of Islamic education with programs for the improvement of maslahah, public goods. Now, why is it important to emphasize this? Viewed from a comparative Islamic perspective, another of Muslim Indonesia's remarkable traits is that it has, I apologize here for talking like a sociologist, Indonesian Muslim society in Indonesia has the most associationalized. It has Islam in the world. In other words, the Islamic civil society sector in groups like Muhammadiyah and but a host of others. It's the largest in the world. Indeed, Indonesia has not just the largest Muslim social welfare organizations in the world, it has the largest religious organizations of any faith in the world, larger than anything that we see in India with Hindus, larger than any of its counterparts in Christians. So again, there's been this remarkable spillover effect between, if you will, the reforms in Islamic education and the spirit of Islam, and Islam that seeks to build associations in groups like NU and Muhammadiyah that seek not just to promote personal piety, though they of course do that, but seek to make society more ethical and better. Now, how is this linkage that I'm talking about made? The answer to this question is that the mass associations organized by groups like Muhammadiyah and who are not just formal institutions, they are networked spaces that play a major role in showing Muslims how to use Islamic education and learning to bring about positive changes in society. Indeed, you've heard me say that's what, from the beginning of the 20th century on, Muslim educators dedicated themselves to. Yes, Islamic learning, but an Islamic learning that would promote a broader maslahah, public good. To take but one example, and I'm going to focus on the Muhammadiyah, but it's an example of this linkage between education and Muslim ethics and the transformation of the society. Let me just refer quickly to the Muhammadiyah. The Muhammadiyah, as we all know, it's the smaller of Indonesia's two large Muslim mass associations. But remarkably, the Muhammadiyah manages some 12,000 schools. 167, actually, I think the number today is about 177 institutions of higher learning, 421, and I think it's actually more like 470 orphanages, 350 to 400 polyclinics and hospitals, as well as a nationwide bank. Here in practice, muamalat practice is demonstrable evidence of a distinctive, and as I've said throughout my remarks today, maslahatized understanding of Islamic ethics in education. Although the process was pioneered by Muhammadiyah over the past century, this effort to transform society through the application of Muslim ideals of a maslahah, public good, was soon replicated in other Islamic welfare associations, not least of all the Nahdlatul Ulama, an organization which, as I said a few moments ago, is the largest religious social welfare organization in the world, whatever the faith. Associational life now so what's this have to do with education? I was asked to talk about education. Associational life is educational in a deep ethical sense, because it teaches Muslims how to realize basic Islamic values, not simply in the abstract, but in concrete, with regard to concrete changes in society. The maslahah-oriented good deeds include, as Indonesian educators show us, they include educating young people, caring for orphans, healing the sick in hospitals and clinics, counseling women in times of family trauma, and a myriad of other activities. Again, Indonesia has the largest religious social welfare organizations, no matter what the faith in the world. This real world realization of Muslim ethical values teaches people in a very practical and consequential manner just what Islam's ethical priorities are and how they should be realized in a concrete way in the world. This is the model that Islamic education in general and Islamic higher education in particular offers the whole world. I'm in my last section here. I'm sorry, I'm going a little late. This second point brings me to my third and last of the legacies I wish to highlight as constituents of modern Muslim education's contribution to Indonesian democracy, citizenship, and the maslahah, public good. This third feature was the conviction among many Indonesian Muslims that Islamic values and ideals are consistent with, rather than contrary to, the multi-ethnic and multi-religious ideals of Indonesian nationhood. What a remarkable distinction. Islam, these huge Islamic associations commit themselves to a multi-religious and multi-ethnic state. Now, we all know that this commitment to Indonesia was not uncontested. There were some people who opposed it. Darul Islam's Kartosuwirjo, as I think all of my Indonesian brothers and sisters know, rejected nationalism, even in its Indonesian form, as seeing it as an un-Islamic principle of organization. But the Muslim proponents of multi-religious nationalism and citizenship in Indonesia, in groups like NU and Muhammadiyah, prevailed over these Islamist components of religious nationalisms. And it was this great commitment of Indonesia's mass organization and Indonesia's Muslim educators to Pancasila democracy and Indonesia's remarkable heritage and multi-religious citizenship that made possible Indonesia's return to democracy in 1988, 1999. This transition was only made possible because it was able to build on the ethical and epistemological revolution wrought by Islamic educators in Indonesia over the course of more than a century, culminating in the reforms to the state Islamic university system in the 1990s and 2000s. I'm not talking about those, but Pak Jabali and Jamhari and others have. And again, Islamic higher education shines in its distinction, shines in its integration of sciences of the world with the sciences of revelation, shines in its commitment and its sophistication that it shows in programs of civic education. It's this history, that as educational history, that helps us to explain why Indonesian Muslim educators have not merely followed, but taken the lead in what I have called the normative work of creating and publicly transmitting Indonesia's traditions of pluralist citizenship and Pancasila-based democracy. So my last paragraph here, I conclude here, just by way of conclusion. By linking good deeds and the public good to the ideals and practice of Pancasila citizenship, Muslim educators in Indonesia have laid a solid moral foundation for a maslahah-based understanding and practice of Islamic education and ethics. This remarkable synergy, this remarkable legacy of Islamic educators and education has been demonstrated, I suggested today, in 3 achievements, without which Indonesia's return to democracy would not have been possible. The achievements I'm referring to are the Muslim educational community's commitment to multi-religious and multi-ethnic nationalism, the Muslim educational community's commitment to an epistemological revolution, integrating the sciences of the world with the sciences of revelation. Remarkable in every way, and reminding us of the remarkable excellence of Islamic higher education in the 12th, 13th, and 14th century Common Era. And third and last, I've referred to and discussed the way in which Indonesian Muslim educators and the educational revolution has laid the foundation for Indonesia to develop the largest and most consequential mass-based Muslim social welfare organizations in the world, larger than anywhere else in the Muslim world, larger than any counterpart in the Christian, Hindu, or other world. In all these regards, it is clear that the richest resources for pluralist citizenship and democratic flourishing in Indonesia don't lie, as some Western observers have said, in some mystery from Indonesia's pre-Islamic past. The key to Indonesia's educational excellence and its democratic and multicultural citizenship achievements lie not in the pre-Islamic period, but in the far-reaching changes in Islamic education and ethics wrought by Islamic educators from the late 18th century on. The Indonesian legacy the legacy of the Muslim community's intellectualization and maslahatization of education, public ethics, and governments remains to this day a compelling force in Indonesian public life. Indeed, as you've heard me say, it is what made possible Indonesia's return to democratic governance. It lies at the very heart of this achievement, also lies at the very heart of this beautiful and compelling project we know today as Islam Nusantara. It too would not have been possible without the remarkable synergies, syntheses, and achievement of Indonesia's Islamic educators. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went a bit too long, but thank you very much for your attention today.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the wonderful and insightful discourse. In fact, I felt like we can even go on and go on and go on, because personally, I have gained a lot of insight from your this particular discourse, and I think others too have gained some things, and they would like to, of course, ask questions. So just to take so once again, thank you very much, Professor. Before we go to the Q&A session, so just to like a synopsis of what I could able to jot down from the presentation of Professor Robert, is that Indonesian country has become like the leading to all countries with regards to the Islamic higher education, because they have not only focused on the piety, but also they have promoted inclusivity and also masla, which is public good. So doing things for the public good, not for personal interest. Also, he mentioned that although madrasa arrived very late in Indonesia, but the Muslim educators could able to rapidly develop a comprehensive curriculum, which were spread across the percentile and really helped to spread Islamic knowledge and ethics to all the citizens. Similarly, he mentioned the role of modern educators by trying to integrate science education and also public education for public good. So the point is for public good, so not for a personal interest, but for the good of all citizens. And the last thing is, he mentioned a particular quote that they are able to achieve this by linking good deeds to public good. So because they link all Islamic moral ethics for the good of the public citizen. So, and I think so I could able to jot that down. So I hereby open the floor, the space for Q&A session. So if you have any question, we have two options here. You can type your question on the chat, or you raise your virtual hand. I can see 2 hands for now. Okay, let me go with Santi. So you can go ahead with your question. You are still on. Oh, okay. Santi, you are. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Am I audible? Okay. So my question is this. First of all, I would like to say thank you so much.
Santi, you'd like to introduce yourself first.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Thank you so much, Professor. I'm Santi Ganiswari from MA student. So I really interesting about your topic, which talk about Islamic education in Indonesia. And then I have a question because my research final paper is about Dayah education. Actually, Dayah education is one of Islamic institution in Indonesia, especially in Aceh. However, in my literature review, I quoted from the book of Islamic Political Defense by Abdul Qadir Jailani, and then he stated that the development of madrasah itself actually from the root of from Samudra Pasai Kingdom, because at the moment of Samudra Pasai Kingdom, Dayah education firstly just becoming the zawiyah and holakoh for learning. However, after that, Sunan Gersik bring this kind of holakoh term into the Java Island, and then after Sunan Gersik did, Sunan Maulana Maulik Ibrahim did separate the awareness of madrasah itself. My question is it really overclaimed? Because I was discussed with my friend, and then my friend said that it was overclaimed because we know that Samudra Pasai Kingdom only from 13 until 16 of century, and then this book claimed that the form of or the root of madrasah itself is come from Samudra Pasai Kingdom, which is from Samudra Pasai Kingdom. So is it really overclaimed? And then as we know that Samudra Pasai Kingdom also fall down after 16th century. And what happened? Because from 16 until 18, we have like 2 centuries and nothing happened about Islamic about the development of Islamic education itself. So is it overclaimed, Professor? Thank you.
Should we go all the questions, or you answer the other, Prof?
You would like me to answer immediately?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's your choice.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's a very, very good question, and it's the contrast between Samudra Pasai and the general area around Malacca and then the Malay Peninsula and that of Java is often raised, and there's no question that both the Daya and the Surau, which are Sumatra-based varieties of Islamic education, had a very early presence and probably a more extensive presence than was the case in the 14th and 15th century in Java. So yes, I think the simple answer to your question is that varieties of Islamic education, even varieties of a systematic education, were already in place 2 or 3 centuries earlier in Sumatra, particularly the critical Malacca Passage, Samudra Aceh region. But here's where there's a little bit of controversy, and I don't want to pretend that we know the actual curriculum of the Surau or the Daya in the 16th, 17th century remains relatively unclear. And inasmuch as the curriculum that we know from Sumatra beginning in the 19th century and then continuing to this day, it incorporates relatively lately, and indeed not much earlier than Java, reforms in Islamic education and learning that came in particular from South Asia and the Middle East. The assumption is that, yes, Daya and Surau existed in an earlier time, but they did not have a the full-blown madrasa curriculum that we associate with madrasas in South Asia and the Middle East, or with madrasas in Sumatra, Java, and indeed Sulawesi and other areas from the 19th century onwards. So that there is Islamic education, it is school-based, but the curriculum still looks to have been much less extensive, much less comprehensive than its counterpart in the Arab, Persian, and Central Asian Muslim lands.
Thank you, Professor, for the answer. Sister Adeusna, yeah. Yes, yes. Yes, you are. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, sorry. I just mute my voice.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Belo, the moderator today, and also Prof. Bob for your presentation. I really appreciate Prof. Nina also, amazing for inviting the best guest lecturer today. I'm very impressed actually with your words, Prof. Hefner. I quote and use many of the articles you wrote as my references in my writing, and I even watch YouTube about NU Muhammadiyah. You speak in that YouTube. I watched several times ago. Really appreciate about it. My question is, this is about the Islamic education, of course. After the end of a new order era, Suharto, in our country, freedom of religious expression became more clearly felt in Indonesia. As we know that this is not for Muslim only, but also for all community of religion in Indonesia, including for Confucius. They are officially recognized at this time at Gus Dur era when he became a president. And for the Muslim community in educational sector, for the example, currently more and more students are wearing the hijab to school. We can see in every school, even the regulation of that hijab is available. And there are also more and more Islamic boarding school or pesantren in many various regions. And also we have two largest community organization in the world, as you said before, NU Muhammadiyah. And my question is, in your opinion, can this revival of the spirit of Islamic education make Indonesia a role model for Islamic education in the world? And as a Muslim, as a country with a Muslim majority in the world, what are the challenges for Indonesia to become a reference country for the Islamic education sector in the world? I hope we can meet you again in another occasion, Prof. Bob, because you are really insightful for me personally. Thank you.
Have you introduced yourself, Ade?
Oh, sorry in advance. My name is Ade Husna, Prof. I am PhD student of educational sector. Currently, I'm still writing about the perspective of teacher from different religious background in educational sector in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll try to keep my answer relatively short. That's a very good question. And of course, your observations about the deepening pietization of society is, I think, are utterly correct. As you can tell, I've come to Indonesia since the late. I'm a little bit older, so I've traveled to Indonesia since I was a graduate student in the late 1970s. And when I first came to Indonesia, there were large swaths of the country where I don't want to be too simplistic, but there were large portions of the country where many people were relatively indifferent to Islam. Many Muslims were relatively nominal, perhaps not as extreme as I think some characterizations made, but there were profound changes. And both my wife and my wife, Nancy Smith, Hefner, has also written about this. And she's written in particular about changes in sociability of young women, the hijab and all. And yes, there's been a huge transformation. But more specifically, let me address your question. Can Indonesia be a role model? This is a very sensitive matter. I think it is a role model, not just for Muslim majority countries. I think it can be a model to a country like the United States. The United States, I would say right now, is having greater difficulty dealing with the complexities of citizen diversity. I think, and I'm not trying to be glib or harsh on my own country, which I think is sometimes a kind of cheap throwaway. But I think the Trump era, the Donald Trump era, showed us that a large swath of America has developed a deep inability to deal with an America that is no longer just Christian, which is no longer just European American. It never was. African Americans and Native Americans were major parts, but a lot of the European Americans ignored that. And I think in this regard, I think Indonesia is a model. Yes, it's a model for the Muslim world with regards to many things, including Islamic education. But it's also a model that needs to be studied. In my most recent book, this is exactly what I said. I said it's not just Muslims who need to look at Indonesia. It's people from the United States, France, and the Netherlands and countries like that, where we have seen as France has 10% of the population and now is Muslim. And that's a development that's taken place over the last 50 years. And for many French, this is an unacceptable and impossible diversity to accommodate. Indonesia is 9.2% Christian. Egypt is 9.3%. These are countries 3% Christian. These are countries that have had complex religious profiles. Indonesia, I think, offers many lessons. So perhaps rather than using the word model, because that may put too much of a burden on Indonesia, and it may also, some people may say, hey, I don't want to be a model. I don't want to look to anybody as a model. But I think Indonesia offers many very important lessons on democracy, a democracy that is not a democracy that says religion has to be private, cannot be brought into the public sphere, but at the same time says religion brought into the public sphere, diverse communities can do so. So yes, I think Indonesia can offer lessons. I perhaps will avoid the term model to both the Muslim world, but also the Western world. Last but not least, I do work as a political scientist as well, although my background is in sociology and anthropology. And I am a great fan and lover of the Arab Muslim world. But the fact is of the 49 Muslim majority countries, there's only one that is right now conducting a political system in a democratic and inclusive way in a truly remarkable way. So perhaps I don't want to tell Iranians or Turks that they should look to Indonesia as a model, but I think they and we in the West should say, yes, Indonesia offers many, many important lessons, many important lessons on how to live together in ethno-religious difference, and to do so in a way that does not require, as some Europeans would insist, that you take religion out of public life. There's the real remarkable balance that Indonesia achieves, and that I think Western people, as well as people in many other societies, would do well to learn from.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your response. Please let me just say this to our questionnaire, that please, whenever I want to raise a question, ensure that you do a very brief introduction, your name, your university, and of course your country. So Karamo, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa barakatuh.
Good morning, Prof. Prof. Robert and Prof. Nina and Bello, my friend. I think my smile could tell the feeling that you feel early morning when you are blessed with such a loaded scholar. I think not me alone, but we all learn a lot from this insightful discussion. And I think before I start, let me just introduce myself. I am Karamo Sise, MS student, IIIU by 3. And I'm from the Gambia, one of the smallest country in Africa, but also one of the largest Muslim, or let me say, the population of the Muslim community, one of the largest population as in terms of percentage, almost to 97% of the population are all Muslims. I think this discussion is quite insightful and quite important as far as the current phenomenon of trying to improve Islamic education across the globe. And I would like to quote Prof. Like he said, Islamic education is only not trying to broaden the faith base of people, but also trying to bring about inclusivity to unify the nation, the world. I've been to Indonesia for now, I think 8 months, but I can say that I learned a lot from the Indonesia, from their cultural perspective and also from the religious education perspective. What I want to ask Prof, my question is, how far have Indonesia gone in the Islamic education in terms of integration of maybe the Western science, we call it secular science and Islamic science, in trying to improve, to better the life of people? I'm asking this because back home, we also have a lot of madrasas, like in the Gambia. We have a lot of Islamic education madrasas, but the higher Islamic education compared to Indonesia is still low. And but also the employability of people that pass through its Islamic schooling or like madrasa education is a question. Students that pass from Islamic madrasas are not allowed to work, are not given the let me say, the certificates to work, and it leads to a higher rate of unemployment in the country. And the other thing is, what could the world, like the Middle East and other African countries that are Muslim majority, learn from Indonesian perspective of Wasatiyah in trying to bring about unity in the world, in trying to solve the problem that we are facing that are caused by religious intolerance, religious extremism? What could we learn from Indonesian perspective of religious inclusivity in terms of Wasatiyah perspective to, reduce what we call the conflict in the world? That's my question. That are the 2 questions that I basically want to answer. Prof, thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, those are 2 very, very important and very critical questions. Let me start with the first one. The question of the integration, I don't call the sciences of the world Western, because Western science would not have emerged were it not for the contribution of Arab, South Asian, and other scholars. Let me take a trivial example. The Western medical understanding of the flow of blood around the body in the 12th century was primitive. There was no understanding, and it was only as a result of the study of Islamic scholars and Middle Eastern scholars in particular, that Western universities, which begin to emerge in the 12th, 13th century, they borrow in textbooks from Muslim lands that deal with things like blood. And then, of course, in mathematics, we know modern mathematics legacy would not have been possible were it not for the contribution of Muslim educators from India, as well as the Arab Middle East. But we can go on and on and on. So, but it is true. I mean, I'm not trying to say Westerners didn't do anything. Actually, once in countries like Sicily and Spain and other parts of Italy in particular, they engaged with the sciences that had been developed in Muslim world, Muslim majority countries. They did develop a kind of momentum of their own. And this I think that's in a separate story. How was that possible? And it wasn't because of European imperialism. Europe did become imperialist in a ruthless and violent way. It attempted to conquer the whole world, unforgivable, immoral. But the rise of the sciences actually preceded that. So there was something one shouldn't think, oh, it was Western imperialism. No, it was the engagement of scientists and scholars with this legacy that came from the Middle East. So for a brief moment, I think that integration worked well, and it was not, my basic point is it wasn't product of what unfortunately would later infect Western societies, which was an arrogance expressed in one of the most awful episodes of imperialism the world has ever seen. Back to the Gambia, however, and it's Mascaromo. Back to the Gambia, we know I've looked at Islamic education in many other parts of the world, never as long as Indonesia. But there are other areas of the Muslim world where that integration is taking place. But it's hard. It's hard because even if in principle a Islamic educator or a school superintendent of Islamic schools believes that we should have a good curriculum that really teaches us about biology. After all, as I just said, Muslims pioneered the study of biology as well as astronomy and mathematics and a whole host of things. When you have such an educator, you still have to train teachers. And if we go here, Indonesia offers a sobering lesson. If we go back to the 1950s in Indonesia, Indonesia was a much poorer country. Political conflict, the rise of a huge communist party and clashes between Muslims and communists. Indonesia was in crisis. And the result was, the economy was in collapse. And even though many people in the Islamic educational sector were already talking about the integration of the sciences, to have somebody teach biology, chemistry, medicine in a high school, let alone a college, requires a significant investment and upgrading. It's very practical. It's not ideological or normative. It's very practical. And that's where, if I don't know the Gambia, and I apologize. I know a little bit about West Africa, primarily Nigeria and then Ghana, two countries that I have had significant number of students from. But the key thing is here Indonesia does offer lessons because Indonesian Islamic educators from the in private schools from the 1920s and 1930s on, they recognize that they've got to improve the quality of general education. They have to train students so they don't shy away from sending Islamic students to general universities. In fact, they try very hard to do so, realizing that won't make them less Muslim. It will make Muslims more knowledgeable and competent in teaching the sciences of the world. That's the simple challenge. And let me just add, finally, That's a challenge that's taken place in all civilizations. The West had it took a long time for science to develop in Western education. The Gambia can do it, but it does require a gifted collaboration between the, if you will, the general educational, or put it in quotes, the secular educational establishment and the religious establishment. In Gambia, that would mean the Muslim establishment. So both parties have to be willing. Last point, even in a country like Pakistan, and Pakistan has brilliant Muslim intellectuals. Those of you who know your Islamic educational and ethical and philosophical history know that Pakistan and South Asia generally has had just great scholars, Islamic and general. But the Islamic educational sector in Pakistan, which is good, has been torn much more than is the case in Indonesia between camps who say, no, we mustn't have Islamic education, the extreme or general education, and then those who the larger community that says, no, there's nothing un-Islamic about studying biology. On the contrary, that's what Muslims have long done. So, but each country, I end here, each country has to work this new consensus, a new operating consensus out on their own. And without it can be difficult. Without it, you really do have to struggle to show the relevance. And here again, you can point to Indonesia, but you can also point to the glorious history of higher education in Iran, Persia, the classical era, the 10th to the 15th century, and say Muslim educators and scientists were once at the forefront of global human knowledge, and they can be and will be again.
Thank you, Professor, for the response. Please, Prof, we still have 2 more questions, and I'm well aware that it's very late from your end. So we are very sorry for that. Okay. So Ms. Novina, please, the space is yours. Remember to do a very brief introduction and also make the question very short. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, good morning, Prof. Robert and everyone. First, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Noviana from Tenaga Ali, the chief expert of Majelis Masyai. And for all, I think it's important to know that Majelis Masyai is independent and autonomous institution in formulating and establishing the quality assurance system for pesantren educations as the mandate of Law 18/2019. Thank you for sharing about the variety of pesantren education system, Islamic boarding system, which is actually different one to another. As a policy regulator, I'm curious from your perspective, Prof, what kind of mechanism should be put in a place to ensure the quality education assurance and accountability in Islamic educational system? So which may differ with one country to another country, with the Middle East and then the Western Islamic ways of thinking. So I want to explore more about it. Thank you.
Well, I think the quality of education is something that has to be assessed. There has to be a recognition, and I'm sure you know this, I'm just repeating a familiar truth. There has to be a recognition of the great diversity of disciplines that characterize whether it's religious knowledge or general knowledge of the sciences of the world. This was already the case back in the classical era of Islamic, the golden era, the golden age of Islamic education, when we saw scholars like Ibn Sina, the great Ibn Sina, who was not just a remarkable jurist and a remarkable scholar of Islamic philosophy, kalam, but he also was a medical scholar. So, but not everybody can be an Ibn Sina. Not everybody, if we move to a Western European context, not everybody, and in fact, very few people can be a Leonardo da Vinci or a Michelangelo. So a critical part of all quality control in higher education, and indeed all varieties of modern education, is that there has to be an effort to create a kind of operating consensus on goals. And that's what you're part of, if I understood you correctly. And that's what Indonesia's have done quite well. I mean, I followed the development of Islamic higher education and general education, but especially Islamic higher education. I was a friend of the late Azumardi Azra. I knew him when he was a graduate student at Columbia University in New York back, I think, in the early 1990s. And I knew him very well. We talked about education. And he was one of these people. First of all, he had played a huge role in the modern upgrading of the UIN EIN, State Islamic University system. There were others. There was Amin Abdullah, many others. Another friend of mine, Amin Abdullah, is in Jogja. But Indonesia was gifted one of its blessings, if I can use this phrase, is that it was gifted by a number of Islamic educators who recognized you had to develop a kind of multi-talented team. You couldn't assume that there's one person among you is going to be able to say, this is it. You had to recognize a variety of standards. You had to recognize that, no, the specialist in mathematics really has to know mathematics. And you have to have teachers who can teach, starting in elementary school, mathematics. And I think this is what's begun to emerge. Indonesia, I think, in Islamic education, achieved such a consensus early on. I think the broader educational task of improving standards is one where Indonesia, and I'm speaking now about national education generally, has made great standards, great progress, but it's still working on exactly how do you apply and teach those standards. And that's not something that I can or anybody else can provide a kind of easy throwaway formula to. It's just to say there has to be a respect for the integrity and diversity of diverse fields of knowledge. And I'm not making a secular argument. I'm saying on the contrary, even in the Islamic sciences, one has to respect the variety and diversity of usul al-din, usul al-fiqh, and all of these remarkable legacies that of learning that Islam has. So one has to have both the general scholars, the Michelangelos, the Leonardo da Vinci's, the Ibn Sina, but you have to also just develop teams. And Indonesians, my last sentence, Indonesians are good at building teamwork. Indonesians are good at building teamwork. I can remember going to a conference at a state Islamic university back in the early 1990s, and a Muslim friend of mine who was from India, whom I'd known him for many years, and he came up to me and he looked at some of the women who were involved in coordinating this international conference. And I don't mean to say anything bad about India or Pakistan or anything, but he turned to me and he said, look at this. These Indonesians, look at how the women and the men, they work together, and there's no sense that women should not be given positions of authority. So I think Indonesians have social skills, leaving aside knowledge, have social skills for collaboration. One used to talk about gotong royong, but it's well beyond village gotong royong, but they have social skills for collaboration and cooperation. And those are very, very valuable resources.
Professor, I think we have like two more persons raising their hand, and we have like two more questions from the chat. But I will allow Brother Jallo, my friend, to quickly raise his question. And probably after that, I can just read the question from the chat. And if we still have time, then I will give Diego the chance to do. Jallo, go ahead.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everybody. My name is Amadou F. Jallo. I'm also an MA student in a wonderful university, Triple IU. And my question read, sorry, I am also from the Gambia. My question read, Prof, after having an insightful elaboration and deliberation of Islamic education in this wonderful country, I would like to ask you on how could we integrate Western notion of democracy and Islamic political system, having in mind the current ongoing wars like Israel-Palestine war, Russia-Ukraine war, the Arab Spring that rose in the year around 2010. With because I could remember in your earlier deliberations you were mentioning issues of such kind. Now, and having in mind that too, you did say although you have you are, but um,
I think
that is my question, Prof.
I think we lost your voice at the tail end of your question, but no problem. Daigo, Prof, I want to give the last question here also to raise his question so that we can answer both together. Is that okay? So Daigo, you can go ahead with your question so that Prof can answer both questions together.
I
And
think
that
he
will
cannot unmute. Staff, please unmute Daigo, please. And you might read the question in the chat first, Bello.
okay. Prof, I will read the question also from the chat because we have two from the chat as well. So I'll read them out. This is from Supriano, an alumnus of the FOE, then who works with the media team of the university. He writes, I have questions regarding Nisha's Islamic education. He said, number one, how do Western scholars generally view the quality of Islamic education in Indonesia? And number two, what should we do to improve our engagement to Western societies and attract people from the West to learn about our Islamic education? Okay, so there you go. So make it brief, please. Make it brief. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Daigo Haule from Tanzania. I'm studying MI Education Triple IU. And my question is, according to the situation, Tanzania is a secular country. My question is based on how Islamic education is affected by the national law, because the country is not allowed Islamic education to have their curriculum and to have their system of running the education. So those education in Islam are guided by the national laws. So do you think how this circumstance is affected Islamic education in Tanzania? You have to know that I'm not a Muslims. I ask it in order to get experience for the further studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did we want to go with one more question, or is that good?
I think that's all for now. Yeah, that's all, Prof. Thank you.
I think I'll begin very quickly, but be very quick, short on the Diego's question. How, or no, I'm sorry. Jallo's question is about democracy in Islam, and then lessons from Israel Palestine. I think you all know that there's not much I can say about Israel and Palestine except that the Israeli destruction of Gaza and of Palestine is not an example of anything that has to do with democracy. And I'm not going to go into further detail because I think all of us in this room probably share a similar opinion. What is to be done, how to help Palestinians, how to help those Israelis who don't agree with the mass displacement and mass killing. These are issues that I think would require a fully different setting. But at the very least, I think we can say that what's happening in Palestine right now is an example that the achievement of democracy for your own population, as took place in some Western European and American countries and North American countries, unfortunately does not guarantee that that same country acts in a democratic and just way with its neighbors. I don't have to remind anybody in this room that the United States had a history of slavery that eventually ripped apart the nation, but it also had a history of what, and I'm not exaggerating here, I'm not being hyperbolic, but an effective extermination of the indigenous Native Americans of this continent who had a variety of different civilizations. So that's one of the paradoxes of democracy, and I won't try to explain it. It is something that I've written about. A democratic culture, even a strong democratic culture within a country, does not guarantee that that same country acts democratically, inclusively, or in a human rights-minded manner. So that with other countries, or with all of its own minorities. So that's that's a kind of sobering reminder that democracy is not a panacea. It doesn't take care of everything. And unfortunately, we're getting a very, very tragic reminder of that in Palestine, Gaza today. Tragic. But it's also a important reminder of any country, whether it's Indonesia, the United States, that we have to be on guard and go beyond just our own national interests, our own narrow interests as a people and community, however important that is. But we also have to elevate something like, like what in international discourse is called, an international human rights agenda. That's complicated. It can take multiple forms. Or an adab that is based on the values, the Adamiya values of humanitarian Islam. And those are there. So, and I think if I could just end this comment, I think with what, for example, both Muhammadiyah, but particularly Nahdlatul Ulama with its fiqh or fiqh peradaban, its civil fiqh hadara program. It's attempting to develop a program that doesn't just, that's consonant with democratic and egalitarian values and just values, but really seeks to promote them well beyond the horizons of the state. So there, I do think Indonesia offers some very, very helpful, and Indonesian Muslims in particular, and in this case, offers some very important lessons that democracy itself, without this broader humanitarian ethical orientation, whether it's in the form of international human rights or fiqh hadara, you need something that opens the horizons of ethics to all of humanity, not just your own nation state. And that's, I think, again, where Indonesia does. So how is Islamic education affected by national laws? We live in an era of nation states, whether one likes it or not. I'm comfortable with it. But we live in an era of nation states, and national legislation, getting the national legislation on religious education in general and Islamic education in particular, getting it right is absolutely vital. And here, I know I'm starting to sound like I'm too much of a Indonesia booster, but here I think Indonesia again does offer lessons. It took some time in the 1950s and early 1960s. There were fierce debates between people of more secular nationalist orientation in Indonesia and then the Muslim community, and also some of the Christian community. Some people wanting a thoroughly secular, get religion out of public life. Not very many Indonesians felt that way, but there were some. And I think it is, as your question suggests, and I don't have any magical final answer, but getting legislators to recognize that religious education can make a vital contribution to the public good. That's part of the problem. And what, again, whether it's in with somebody like Tariq Ramadan, a man whom I happen to have I've met him and I have a lot of respect for him. He's the grandson of Hassan Abana, and of course he lives in Switzerland now. If you listen to the way he talks about the need to kind of craft legislation that can integrate, the sciences of the world with the science of religion, you need figures like that in every country to convince legislatures, not just to formulate general laws, but actually work them into the details. Here again, Indonesia has been doing this for the better part of 60 years. And with each decade, they've gotten a clearer and I think all the more sophisticated sense so that as to how to achieve this integration. And they are, I think, in this regard, a true model. How to teach Western societies about Islamic education and how to teach people in the West about Islam, I think was one of the questions here from chat. I'll just be brief because this is something that I've tried to dedicate my life to. It's not easy, but let me say, it's not as bad as is sometimes thought. If you read Sam Huntington, a man I knew who talked about the clash of civilizations, it sometimes sounds as if, the great majority of people in the West and in the United States in particular are Islamophobic. And to my relief, I've done research on this in the United States, and I've worked with Muslim educators and Muslim public intellectuals here in the United States, the UK, and France. And I would say that actually there are Islamophobes, and unfortunately, one of them is running for the president of the United States. I won't mention any names. I lament that. But the other thing that I've learned is that in watching the response to people who vilify Islam, I've come to recognize that actually there's a broad wellspring of opinion in the United States, in the United Kingdom, perhaps a little less in France, because France is a very secular society. It's much more secular than America. The majority of Americans are religious, whatever their faith. The majority of French are kind of skeptical about religion. There are some people who are religious, Muslims, Catholics, but France is a much more secular place. But in countries like the United States, there's great interest in Islam. Great interest in Islam. So people like you, people like me, we have a job, and that's a job that I've been trying to do in my own small way, but with many Muslim brothers and sisters, and with many just people who work on Islam. And I think if I compare Americans' understanding of Islam and the richness of Islamic civilization, if I compare that understanding today with 20 years, let alone 30, 40 years ago, there's been great progress. So please don't think that Sam Huntington, in all of his clash of civilizations bombast, he actually is not representative, I think, of majority opinion. But yes, as your question implies, I and all of us who work on and teach on Islam in the United States, we have more work to do as well. Not least of all, when we look at events like those taking place so tragically in Gaza, Palestine.
Thank you, Professor, for all the responses you have made. We are almost done with the session, and I will give the space to Prof. Nina for a closing remark before we close the session.
Thank you very much, Pak Bob, for accepting our invitation and for your enlightening lecture to our students and other participants. And I'm looking forward to meeting you in person in our campus in November. I hope, I'm sorry for your accidents, and I hope you will get better soon. So have a rest. Good night. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you,
Walaikum
Bonnie.
assalam wa barakatuh. So with this, I think we have come to the end of this session. But I think thank you very much to Professor, to the Dean, to all our audience for this time, for your time and participation. So we sincerely appreciate every one of you. And I close the session by saying Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen. So inshallah we'll meet later. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Okay.